All right, everybody, welcome back to Introduction to U.S. Multicultural Literatures. Today we are going to discuss some more of the poetry of the postmodernist era, of that moment in, let's say, the 1960s and 70s, when this idea of postmodernism became a cultural dominant and when ideas of multiculturalism started to become even more prominent in mainstream culture than they had been before with some of the social movements of the 1960s. So I want to discuss a few poems of that basic moment in American cultural history, and then maybe we'll begin discussing Philip Roth's The Ghostwriter by the end of today's lecture, and then again, maybe we will have to begin talking about that with the next lecture. But in any case, it's okay. It's a very short novel, really more of a novella, so I think discussing it in 2 lectures will be sufficient. So I don't usually begin with a review, but I want to begin with a very brief review of the relationship between postmodernism and multiculturalism as I see it, to lead into my discussion of a few poems from this era. So, postmodernism, we remember, is a movement across the arts, in philosophy, in other areas, sort of in all areas of culture, so much so that people don't really agree about whether or not it is just a cultural movement or it's a general condition in which we all live. But in any case, the idea of postmodernism is a lack of belief in grand narratives, an inability to believe any longer in any big claims about what is true or right. And with that, an acknowledgement of the inevitable plurality of cultures and ways of thinking and ways of living. And another part of that is a belief that the things we take to be true and the things we take to be right are really just a set of social and cultural images and signs that tell us who we are and that tell us what's true, but these in fact are just socially constructed. They're just social constructs. There's no reality to them. There's no kind of deep truth underlying them. And so we then talked about the relationship between postmodernism and multiculturalism. And we said, on the one hand, postmodernism and multiculturalism share a rejection of former values and beliefs that considered themselves universal, but were really just the beliefs and practices of particular groups of people that were sort of imposed by force upon the world. So if you think back to the 19th century and early 20th century, the collapse of the European empires, their belief that they had the way, that all other cultures needed to go their way. I think postmodernism and multiculturalism would share a belief that these are essentially just false truth claims, or not even false, but just constructs, because postmodernism is not about true or false. It's that everything is equally constructed. And so in that case, postmodernism and multiculturalism are equivalent expressions of that pluralism. On the other hand, postmodernism might be as destructive of multiculturalism as it is destructive of the former monoculturalism. Because if postmodernism's claim is that all cultures are constructed, then that means the cultures that were let me put it this way. That means cultures that are oppressed as well as those that are oppressors. They're both equally constructed, and they're both equally oppressively normative. That is, they make claims about what's true and right within themselves. So even a culture that has been, let's say, oppressed by a dominant culture, that culture still has ideas of domination within itself. It still organizes itself according to certain hierarchies. It still makes certain claims to truth. It still considers itself true rather than merely constructed. So in that way, postmodernism might be destructive of multiculturalism. And for that reason, there are those that would claim that multiculturalism is morally superior to postmodernism. Because if postmodernism says you can't make valid universal claims about what's true, good, real, and right, then you can't say why it was bad that some cultures oppressed others. You can't say why it's wrong for oppression to take place, and you can't resist oppression. So the relationship between postmodernism and multiculturalism, even in the abstract, is contentious and it's hard to understand. And I lead with that. I wanted to review that because we're going to move into a bunch of poems now that I don't think are necessarily all that postmodernist, even though they come up in the postmodernist moment. I think they are poems that do make claims about what's good and real and true, but they are making them on behalf of groups, whether you consider them as cultures or other kinds of relational or affinity groups that were oppressed by a normative dominant culture, whether that is white culture, whether that is male culture, whether that is heterosexual culture. So, and at least one of these poems, I think, is going to illustrate some of the problems with making extreme, claims for culture. So we're going to see it. We're going to see how that works in practice. I just wanted to give you that review as an introduction. So the first poem I want to look at, I want to look at this one briefly because Lawrence Ferlinghetti was a poet who belonged to, I think, the moment in poetry and literature that was just before postmodernism and that I think led into it, which is a movement that many of you are probably familiar with, because I think this is still, even though it's 70 years old, I think it's still a popular movement in American culture, and it influenced a lot of popular culture and youth culture that came after it. And that's the movement of the Beats. So the Beats were a group of artists and writers in the 1950s and 60s who were opposed to established moral values. They were opposed to that culture of sober, gray, impersonal late modernism that we talked about in the mid-century, and they were seeking a much more sort of ecstatic, spiritual, individualistic form of self-realization in art. And for this they turned particularly to a kind of incipient multiculturalism. They looked very much to Eastern cultures as they understood them. There could, of course, be an issue of kind of cultural misunderstanding, cultural appropriation here, but nevertheless, they looked to things like Buddhism and Hinduism. They looked to African American forms of expression like jazz, though they're not solely a white movement. And they also sought unfettered sexual expression, and many of their books were banned as obscene. They sought ecstasy through drugs. They were one of the first movements. Well, I don't actually know if this is true. Let me think. I don't want to think too long. They were the first probably movement in American culture, I would say, that was overtly fueled by drugs other than alcohol, which is a drug and which fueled prior movements. But they, turned to marijuana, to psychedelics, and things like that as well. And the name Beat comes from this idea of, it's kind of a play on words of beaten down, this kind of generation that saw itself as lost within this oppressive modernist structure, but also beatific, beatified, sort of holy, sort of like if you know the idea of the holy fools, somebody's too good for this world, in touch with spiritual values that are too good for this world. So they were both beaten down and beatified, and in that sense they were beat. And Lawrence Ferlinghetti, why is he my example of this movement, even though he's not the most famous example of this movement? It's really for a bad reason rather than a good one, which is that the anthology I have suggested to you is at least an optional text from this class, which is where I draw the poetry selections from, the Penguin Anthology of 20th Century American Poetry, edited by Rita Dove. This anthology ran into some trouble where some of the estates or authors who were very famous, who held the copyrights on certain poems, were asking for a very large fee for Rita Dove and for Penguin publishers. And so some of the most famous poems of 20th century American poetry didn't end up in this book. because of that, because the publisher couldn't pay the fee or refused to pay the fee. It's not the editor's fault. It's not Rita Dove's fault. It was the publisher's responsibility to pay that, and they didn't. And so the most famous example of beat poetry is, of course, Allen Ginsberg's Howl, Howl. But Allen Ginsberg's estate was asking an exorbitant fee for the reprints for that book, and I didn't want to go, in case those of you who bought the book, I didn't want to go out of the book for my examples. So we can say that Allen Ginsberg's estate is the reason I didn't ask you to read the most famous example of this, because they were charging too much. Strange for a poet who considered himself some kind of anarcho-communist, but that's okay. So we will turn instead to Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who's an interesting poet in his own right. He was a member of the Beat movement, born in 1919, and I believe still alive, 101 years old. He was born in Yonkers, New York, to Italian immigrant parents. He attended University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and Columbia, New York, and got his doctoral degree in Paris in comparative literature. Comparative literature, if you don't know, people sometimes ask, what is that? Like, what do you compare it to? Comparative literature means that you are explicitly studying and addressing literature in more than one language. That's the sense in which it's comparative. So I emphasize his extreme education because it's ironic in the light of the poem we're going to look at. But he ended up settling in San Francisco in 1950, and San Francisco is one of the hubs of beat poetry, as it would later be one of the hubs of the 60s era hippie counterculture. The famous intersection in San Francisco of Haight-Ashbury, H-A-I-G-H-T, and then Ashbury, A-S-H-B-U-R-Y, was the kind of home of the hippies. So he settles in San Francisco right when it's becoming this countercultural hub, this hub of poets and artists and writers who want to go against the dominant culture. He meets the beat poets there and anarchists. I think he considered himself as well an anarchist. All the beat poets were, at least in the 50s, considered themselves politically radical, though one of the beat writers, Jack Kerouac, famously did become a conservative later in his life. But Ferlinghetti, I think, has kept the anarchist faith. And he founded what you see there in the picture on my slide, City Lights Bookstore, which is still a famous bookstore and a famous small press that publishes poetry and literature of a countercultural nature. And he was famously also arrested for publishing Allen Ginsberg's Howl, which was considered an obscene poem for reasons you would see if you read it. You can, despite the fact that it can't appear in our anthology, you can find it online, Howl, H-O-W-L. You can even find it, on YouTube, and you can just listen to it, which is actually probably a better way to experience it than just reading it on the page, though it is obscene even by today's standards. So caution if you don't like that sort of thing. And he is engaged in political activism as well as poetry throughout his life. And I think what interests me about his poem, Populist Poetry, is it's a poem that asks poets, I think, to abandon modernism. That is, to abandon that aspect of modernism that clung to the idea that poetry was the best that had been thought and said, that culture was the best that had been thought and said, and descend to the streets and come out and speak to the people. And I think that is a good sort of indicator and a kind of forerunner of the poetry of the social movements of the 1960s. Sorry, I just knocked something over. If you heard that, it's okay. I picked it up. Sorry. What was I saying? If I don't edit. I should edit things out, but I don't edit. I think you're better off just hearing an actual human voice. So I knocked something over. I've picked it up. I'm back on track. So his call for poets to descend into the streets is, I think, a good example of the forerunner of the popular poetry, of the poetry that considered itself a kind of adjunct to popular social movements that we're going to see when we look at the poetry of the 60s in a minute. And I think that what's postmodern about that, even if some of the poems aren't postmodern, what's postmodern is the pluralism of the gesture. Don't worry so much about some hierarchical standard of what makes poetry good, what makes it great, what makes it the best, what makes it ideal, and just get out there and mingle with the populace, with the pluralism of the populace. So I'm going to read. It's a very long poem. If you read the whole thing, I'm just going to read a few selections and make a couple comments on it. No time now for our little literary games. No time now for our paranoias and hypochondrias. No time now for fear and loathing. Time now only for light and love. We have seen the best minds of our generation destroyed by boredom at poetry readings. Poetry isn't a secret society. It isn't a temple either. Secret words and chants won't do any longer. The hour of oming is over. The time of keening come. A time for keening and rejoicing over the coming end of industrial civilization, which is bad for earth and man. So, couple things there. You'll note we talked about, when we discussed Richard E. Kim's The Martyred, the increasing professionalization of creative writing as signaled by creative writing becoming a track in higher education, which is something that happened in the middle of the 20th century that hadn't happened before. And so now, and we actually even saw, if you want to be paranoid, the Ferlinghetti cautions against it, that even the CIA played a role in making that happen. Well, Ferlinghetti is resisting this, that professional poetry is boring, poetry readings are boring, poetry as this professional guild isn't something that we should strive for. What we should strive for is keening rejoicing. So keening is like a loud mourning cry, MOURNING. So both mourning and celebrating with the people. And what's the purpose of this? Well, he names an overt political goal. He wants to challenge industrial civilization. So that's a very far-reaching goal. That's not just, we've seen poets want to challenge capitalism before, but capitalism is only part of industrial civilization. Communism is also part of industrial civilization. He wants to challenge the whole thing in the name of earth and man. So he goes on, where are Whitman's wild children? Where the great voices speaking out with a sense of sweetness and sublimity? Where the great new vision, the great worldview, the high prophetic song of the immense earth and all that sings in it and our relations to it? Poets, descend to the street of the world once more, and open your minds and eyes with the old visual delight. Clear your throat and speak up. Poetry is dead. Long live poetry, with terrible eyes and buffalo strength. Don't wait for the revolution, or it'll happen without you. Stop mumbling and speak out. So when he mentions Whitman, that's Walt Whitman, the 19th century American poet who also was a big influence on Langston Hughes. He's saying there is a precedent for this in American poetry. There was Whitman, who was this wild, or at least portrayed himself as this wild poet who was considered obscene in his time, who self-published his own work, who wrote about the word en masse. He said the word for the great American masses. He said America is the greatest poem. He didn't stay cloistered. He was a working class guy himself, and he went into the streets and wrote poetry out of that. So Ferlinghetti, as a beat poet, and other beat poets called for similar things, is calling for this new popular literature of the streets that removes it from modernism's kind of ivory tower. So ironically, though, what's ironic about this poem is it's full of allusions that, you know, somebody with a PhD in comparative literature would make. So we have the line, we have seen the best minds of our generation destroyed. That's the first line of Allen Ginsberg's Howl. We have references to Whitman. We have references in other parts of the poem to French poetry. So despite his call for a popular poetry, his poetry itself, even in that call, is a bit learned. And I don't say that to make fun of him for hypocrisy. That's not my point. My point is that I think this is a difficult position in which literature finds itself, which is that you do... it does, I think, just being really honest about it, a lot of literature does require a certain amount of educational preparation to appreciate. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, I think that's just kind of the truth. And so a lot of calls for a popular poetry like this, I think, sort of run aground on that contradiction. So that's a contradiction we can observe in this poem, but it's a very long poem and there's much more to talk about in it, and you could write a paper on it that would be good, I think, because I can't talk about nearly the whole thing. But I just wanted to point out the beat movement as a forerunner to the protest poetry and the social poetry of the 60s, and as a signal moment in American literature of the 1950s. So with that, I want to turn to one of those poems, a kind of poem that is an example of the poetry of the social movements of the 1960s. I want to turn to Adrian Rich and her work as an example of feminist poetry as it was understood in that time. So Adrian Rich lived from 1929 to 2012. She was born to a well-off Southern family in Baltimore and was raised Protestant, but her father was Jewish. And she's written a lot about that, about sort of reclaiming aspects of her Jewish identity that weren't really present in her upbringing. So that, I think, signals the way that questions of identity are foregrounded when you look at multicultural literature of the 20th century. She, like Gertrude Stein before her, was educated at Radcliffe, and like Muriel Rukeyser before her, she was selected for the Yale Younger Poets Series, this prestigious prize where young poets could submit their first book and a famous author would choose it for publication. And so W.H. Auden, a British American poet who's also represented in the Penguin Anthology of 20th Century American Poetry, selected Rich's first book for publication in 1951. So she had great success out of the gate. Her early poetry is very much in the vein of kind of very formal, impersonal late modernism, and she would abandon that style later in the 60s. But let's go back in her life. And in the early 50s, she marries an older professor and has 3 children. However, in the 1960s, her and her husband become involved in protest movements, in the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement. Her work becomes overtly political, especially around issues of gender, but also the way gender intersects with these other things. She too thought that things like the Vietnam War were products of industrial civilization's kind of death drive, its drive to control everything unto death and to produce kind of imperialist violence. But and she thought of that, she came to think of that industrial civilization as part and parcel of patriarchal civilization, of men's dominance. And so she begins to call into question everything that would seem to support men's dominance in line with the feminist movement of the time. So she begins to think that, is heterosexuality, for instance, this is one of her thoughts, is heterosexuality natural? Or is simply pretending it's natural the way in which male dominance perpetuates itself by asking men to marry women to produce children, which in her view, by its nature, tends to leave women in a subordinate role in society. So you can see there, that's a postmodern gesture. The thing we took to be natural, heterosexuality, men and women having children, that's just a cultural construct. And as a cultural construct, it can be critiqued. We can do without it. What's not postmodern about that, though, is that it's coming from a rival truth claim, a rival system of values, which says that industrial civilization is bad, patriarchy is bad, women have been suppressed and need to resist, queer people have been suppressed and need to resist. Those are truth claims. Those are, I would even say, universal truth claims. And so you can see the way in which the postmodern skepticism of all truth claims allows rival truth claims to supplant the old truths. So there's a postmodern moment in this way of thinking that's then sort of that is then usurped by a rival system of normative values. Okay, so that's how I would characterize Adrian Rich's thought. And she put this thought into practice. She leaves her husband. She now identifies at this stage of her life as lesbian and has a lifelong partnership with a writer named Michelle Cliff. And the rest of her life she spends writing poetry and essays on cultural and political themes. I was just in my explanation of her thought drawing on one of probably the most famous of her essays on those themes, which is heterosexual. No, sorry. It's called Compulsive Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence. And so, compulsory heterosexuality, there you see in the very name, her view is her, represents her view that heterosexuality is something forced on women by dominant culture to perpetuate itself. And I think that view is articulated in poetry in this poem, which is the eighth poem from a sequence of sonnets she wrote called 21 Love Poems. And if you know anything about the history of poetry, you'll know that the sonnet, think of the works of Shakespeare or also the Italian poet Petrarch, if you're familiar with him, Petrarch. The sonnet has been particularly associated with love poetry. And so Rich writes a sequence of 21 sonnets, 21 love sonnets. The difference, though, is that traditionally, historically, sonnets were written by men, often to a female love object who never speaks in the sonnets. Not always, by the way. A lot of Shakespeare's sonnets seem, scholars are still debating to this day about what's going on there, but a lot of Shakespeare's sonnets seem to be addressed to a male in a loving way. So it's not that they've always necessarily been heterosexual, but it has always been a male dominated genre. So Rich takes the opportunity to write a set of 21 love sonnets about a lesbian relationship. And I think these are autobiographical poems about her relationship with Michelle Cliff. And so I just want to read this. It's not very long, so I'll read the whole thing and then make a few remarks about it. So this is the 13th. Did I say the 8th? It's the 13th in this sequence. I was misreading the Roman numeral. So X is 10, and then 10 plus 3 is 13. So 13. The rules break like a thermometer. Quicksilver spills across the charted systems. We're out in a country that has no language, no laws. We're chasing the raven and the wren through gorges unexplored since dawn. Whatever we do together is pure invention. The maps they gave us were out of date by years. We're driving through the desert, wondering if the water will hold out. The hallucinations turn to simple villages. The music on the radio comes clear, neither Rosenkavalier nor Gotterdammerung, but a woman's voice, singing old songs with new words, with a quiet bass, a flute, plucked and fingered by women outside the law. So, again, this recapitulates what I was just saying about her theory of gender and sexuality, which is she's dismissing, in the manner of the postmodernists, the old rules. The rules break like a thermometer. And note the appropriateness of that simile. The rules break like a thermometer. Why might a thermometer break? Well, if it gets too hot. And so that's appropriate for a love poem, which is about kind of emotional heat between people, a poem that has kind of erotic references about sexual desire. So it's, the rules break like a thermometer. You can't measure anymore. Quicksilver, which is the mercury, the thing inside the thermometer that is I hate to talk about science, that is a liquid that is very sensitive in its expansion and contraction to temperature. It is now overspilling across the charted systems. Everything charted has gone. Everything measured has gone. Measurement, charts, language, law, all of these things belong to the old truth claims, the patriarchy, the heterosexual patriarchy. All that's gone. And so where is our speaker going? It's a collective speaker. We, this couple, they're chasing the raven and the wren through gorges unexplored since dawn. And what interests me about that is that now you have the non-postmodern moment, because where are they going? They're going into nature. They're going into a nature that has been suppressed, that has been repressed by the culture of heterosexual patriarchy. And so what has been suppressed is women's true nature, queer people's true nature, the true nature of sexual desire. That needs to come to the fore. However, the next line interestingly kind of contradicts. Whatever we do together is pure invention. So now they're exploring this new nature, but they're going to invent a new language, a new culture while exploring it. So she acknowledges that if you think back, I would contrast this poem to Muriel Rukeyser's The Poem as Mask. Rukeyser said, throw off the old dominant paradigm and seek women's true nature, which she identified with the body giving birth. Adrian Rich says, yes, cast off the old dominant paradigm and explore women's true nature, but then invent a new culture. Whatever we do together is pure invention. And she admits that this is dangerous. We're driving through the desert wondering if the water will hold out. So it's not simplistic celebration. She admits that if you get rid of the old rules and you get rid of the old maps and the old laws and the old languages, you put yourself at some risk of being lost, of being abandoned. And the Beat poets wrote about this risk, that, I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed. They wrote about this idea that you could lose yourself in this quest. And I think that gives this poetry a certain gravity. It's not a simplistic celebration of the destruction of the old and the birth of the new. It says that comes at a cost. You're taking a risk. Nevertheless, the poem ends with an assertion of making a new culture. So they turn on the music on the car radio, which, so the idea is they're driving through the desert and the radio is picking up different signals and it's going in and out. The music comes clear. And it's neither Rosenkavalier nor Götterdämmerung. Now, I'm sure these are operas, by the way. So these are two operas, one by Richard Strauss and one by Wagner, Wagner, two German composers. And I'm not an opera person, so I can't go into the detail of what these operas mean for this poem. I'm sure there's a lot of detail you could go into. But one thing I would definitely say at the most general is that the point about what's not playing on the radio is it's not high cultural music of men. And I do think both Strauss and Wagner were at least adjacent in some way to fascism, at least kind of precursors in their cultural ideals of Nazism. I think that's fair to say, I hope. So I just mean, I hope it's fair to say. I hope I'm not slandering them. And so I think what Rich is doing is she's saying not the old patriarchal male high culture which led to fascism. That's not what's on the radio, but a woman's voice singing old songs, because remember, women's nature, queer nature has been suppressed. It's not new. It's been suppressed by this dominant culture with new words. It's been suppressed, but we're going to reinvent it. We're going to make it anew. We're going to create it anew. So it's a complex thought. There is something real. There is something true. There is something that's been suppressed, but we need to recreate it. We need to invent it with a quiet bass. Okay, a quiet bass. Not, at least of the two named operas here, Götterdämmerung by Wagner. I don't know a lot about Wagner, but one thing you know about Wagner, even if you don't know anything about him, is that his music is thunderingly loud. At least, Wagnerian as an adjective means thunderingly loud operatic music. But this music rejects that kind of what I think Rich would have regarded as men throwing their weight around in musical form, and instead gives you a quiet bass, a flute plucked and fingered by women outside the law. So I'm not going to elaborate, but I think the verbs there have a sexual connotation, and then women outside the law. outside that normative dominant law. So here's an example of feminist poetry, of queer poetry that is coinciding with the movement for women's liberation, with the movement for queer liberation that's happening in the late 60s and through the 70s. And I think it's a poem that's really complex in the way in which it deals with this question of, postmodernism's relation to liberation, postmodernism's relation to these liberation movements, the need to deconstruct the old, the law, the true, the normative, the dominant, the high, but also to seek what it suppressed and recreate a new culture out of that. So in that way, it's a very rich poem. Okay, I want to move now to a poem that is exemplary of some of the other social movements of the 60s going alongside women's liberation, gay liberation. I want to turn to Amiri Baraka's most famous poem, Black Art. Now, if you read this, you'll know that if you read this, you won't be surprised if I tell you it's a very controversial poem. It's a very controversial poem for a number of reasons. But it's also a very famous poem. It's a poem that gave its name to a whole literary and cultural movement of the time. And it's a poem that I think is, we've talked about this a couple times in this class with writers like Ezra Pound. We might talk about it with writers like Philip Roth. A writer whose work or whose life is somehow sort of morally compromised. And in Baraka's case, it's a little bit similar to Pound's case, which is, I think they each were, how can I put it? Each were, at points in their lives, persuaded by what I might broadly call a fascist worldview, and one that had anti-Semitism as a chief component. And you can see the anti-Semitism in this poem, along with homophobia and sexism. And how do you deal with a poet with a poem that's compromised in that way if it's otherwise a powerful work, as this, I think, is also a powerful work and a famous work? I think the best thing to do is, well, I don't know. It's a very complicated question. I don't know what the best thing to do is. What I propose to do, what I'm going to do in this class, is examine it critically. Why is it the way it is? Why did these writers think in these ways? What is it that led them there? How do they express it in their work? What can we understand about these, I think we can all agree, dangerous ideologies in their work? And then what in their work is still valuable? What in their work is countervailing to these dangerous ideas, these wrong ideas? So that's how I propose to look at it. It's a controversial poem, so I'm not even going to read the whole thing because there are things in this poem I don't necessarily want to read aloud on video. But I want to look at it, I do want to look at a few passages, so I will read a few things that you might be offended by. You can just drag the cursor on past the poem if you don't want to deal with it. But first we need to understand who Amiri Baraka is. So he lived from 1934 to 2013. He was born Everett Leroy Jones in Newark, and his mother was a social worker and his father a postal supervisor. He went to Rutgers, to Howard, and to Columbia, so that's a mix of Howard being a historically black university, Columbia in New York, Rutgers in New Jersey, but he never took a degree. And he joined the Air Force but was discharged because from an early period in his life he was interested in radicalism. So he was discharged from the Air Force because he had communist literature on his person. And he moved to Greenwich Village, and there he married a white Jewish woman named Hetty Cohen. And he got involved with beat poets and with New York school poets. So his early work is kind of similar to, beat poetry and New York school poetry. And we just looked at Ferlinghetti's work as an example of beat literature. And in the last lecture, we looked at Frank O'Hara's work as an example of New York school poetry. And he knew, at least he knew O'Hara. I don't know if he knew Ferlinghetti. He probably did, but he knew all the major poets in this movement. However, in 1965, he had a kind of radical turn. So he becomes, at that moment, so he had been he'd been interested in radicalism, he'd been interested in communism, he'd been interested in anti-racist movements. But it's in 1965 that he adopts a black nationalist perspective. A perspective that says that, and we saw the seeds of this in Alan Locke's New Negro essay, and we sort of pointed it out. That was a view that said that African Americans, or in fact black people worldwide, have been oppressed by the white world and need to find forms of culture that are totally free of white influence and seek their sources of their culture in their own traditions, in the traditions of the African diaspora. So that was the ideology he begins to espouse in 1965. And he changes his name to Amiri Baraka, which means, so Amiri means prince, Baraka means blessing, and he even sort of gives himself the title Imamu, spiritual leader. So he became the Imamu Amiri Baraka, the spiritual leader, prince, blessing, as a part of his rejection of white culture, his rejection of his white name, and his adoption of names from African languages and traditions. He leaves his wife because part of this black nationalism is a hostility toward racial mixing. And we saw that too as evidence to something that was happening in the Harlem Renaissance in Quicksand, where for instance, Helga's friend Anne was kind of violently opposed to racial mixing. So this nationalist belief in kind of pure racial essentialism, the belief that within races were certain essences. And so he leaves his wife and he becomes part of the Black Arts movement. So the Black Arts movement was the artistic wing of the Black Power movement. So you had, on the one hand, you had the civil rights movement, and that was the leading person associated with that is Martin Luther King. And I think the kind of ideas espoused in the civil rights movement that we've encountered in this course, we encountered in the poem Middle Passage by Robert Hayden. And you'll remember that we suggested that the end of that poem, with its assertion of, John Quincy Adams, the former president, pleading to the Supreme Court on behalf of the slave uprising on the ship the Amistad, that suggested a kind of universalism. You remember the refrain of Middle Passage is voyage through death to life upon these shores. And that was an idea we also saw in Alan Locke's Manifesto of the New Negro, that African Americans embody the universal values that America has always claimed to espouse more than any other Americans, because America valued freedom, it valued democracy, yet it withheld freedom and democracy from African Americans more than almost anybody else. And so the African American freedom struggle was a struggle to realize the true universal ideals of American culture. That's Robert Hayden. That, I think, is, I hope I'm not oversimplifying too much if I say that's, I think, what Martin Luther King stood for, among other things. That's the civil rights movement. That's the kind of integrationist wing of the Black freedom struggle. But there was always a different wing, and we saw it too in Alan Locke's essay, which was separatist, which was non-integrationist, anti-assimilationist, that said, no, the thing that white American culture did to African Americans came from some deep place in white American culture, in European culture, and African Americans and Black people worldwide shouldn't have anything to do with it. They should reject that in its entirety and seek their own values in themselves. So the Black Arts movement is, in the 60s, the artistic wing of this anti-integrationist, anti-assimilationist movement. It takes its name because Amiri Baraka himself founds what it was called the Black Arts repertory theater in Harlem. So it begins with the founding of a theater in Harlem. And a lot of notable writers, some of whose names you know, were involved in this. Nikki Giovanni, Maya Angelou, Sonia Sanchez, writers you can find in the Penguin Anthology of 20th Century American Poetry. And it was, if they weren't involved in it, it was an influence on certain later writers, perhaps most famously Toni Morrison, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature. So the idea was to study your own culture, create authentic art, and as one of the other artists involved with it, Larry Neal, said, he said, it's about the destruction of the white thing, destruction of white ideas. So Amiri Baraka takes up this worldview in the late 60s. Now, interestingly, he later abandoned it. He later abandoned it for communism, for which was a universal ideology of liberation. He came to see black nationalism as too narrowly nationalistic and wanted to focus on instead the liberation of all peoples. But he remained controversial to the end of his life. He became the Poet Laureate of New Jersey in, I think, the late 90s and early 2000s, and was dismissed from that position because he wrote a poem about the attacks of September 11th, in which he suggested foreknowledge of the US government and of the Israeli government, and that was taken to be a sign that he had never really abandoned the anti-Semitism that you see in this poem. Now, why anti-Semitism? Why is anti-Semitism part of a nationalist worldview, whether that be, I don't mean to make a false moral equivalence, but I'm just talking formally. If you have a nationalist worldview, it seems like anti-Semitism comes with that. And, you know, the Nazis had a very nationalist worldview. Anti-Semitism was a part of that. What is the relation there? Well, we're going to explore this because I want to get clear on this, because it's going to be the ideological background to Philip Roth's novel, which is a novel by a Jewish American writer about literary responses to anti-Semitism. So what is the nature of anti-Semitism? Why would a poet like Amiri Baraka adopt this ideology when adopting black nationalism? There's a couple things. One is that Jewish culture has long been a diaspora. It has long been a culture that has, you know, before the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, it has been a diasporic culture where Jewish people have lived in a variety of nations throughout the world. And one of the reasons nationalism often accompanies anti-Semitism is because if you want to consider your nation a pure ethnic state where everybody has to be of German ancestry, or everybody has to be of African ancestry, then you are necessarily going to find yourself adopting a hateful and exclusive attitude toward people living within your nation that have a different ancestry. So in that sense, anti-Semitism and nationalism go together. There's something else, though, and I think this unites Amiri Baraka with Ezra Pound, which has to do with the anti-capitalist worldview. So a common anti-Semitic stereotype, which goes back to the European Middle Ages, has to do with the association of Jewish people with money. And where does that come from? That comes from laws in medieval Europe that forbade Christians from charging interest. That is to say, if a Christian loaned money, it was considered unchristian for the Christian to charge interest on the loan. The problem with that, I think, I'm not an economist, but I think the economic problem with that is that that limits economic growth. So if you want to be part of a society that has economic growth, you need to have interest charged, I think. Again, I'm not an economist. So medieval European societies, because they had this law prohibiting Christians from charging interest, they still needed banking with interest to occur. for economic growth, because you needed to make it worth the while of a bank to loan money to people to put, to create some venture. So the interest makes the loan worthwhile, and you need to have these loans happening if you want to have further economic development, because people need loans if they're going to, build something, go somewhere, and create other forms of economic opportunity. So interest had to be charged. So what they tended to do in medieval European societies was they turned to Jewish people as people who, not being Christian, were permitted to lend money. And this also went along with the exclusion of Jewish people from other areas of cultural, economic, political, and civic life. So that's where the association of Jewish people with money comes from. It comes from these Christian exclusionary laws in medieval Europe. And so thereafter, after the Middle Ages, when there are economic bad times in European and then other societies, when people want to turn against the system of economics that's exploiting them, Jewish people become the scapegoat for that. There's even a famous phrase for this, which was coined early in the 20th century, which is anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools, which is to say that anti-Semites are angry about being exploited by capitalism, but instead of turning their anger on capitalism, they turn their anger on the scapegoat of Jewish people. So they should be socialists, they should just be anti-capitalists, but instead they scapegoat Jewish people and become anti-Semites. And that, I think, is why you see, so I'm going to retrospectively explain Ezra Pound, and I'm going to explain Amiri Baraka in these terms. That's why you see these poets adopting this anti-Semitic view as a kind of derangement of their anti-capitalist view. And it's a derangement that goes back 1,000 years to Europe. And I think that I explain this at length because it's part of what Philip Roth and some of the other poets I asked you to read, like Delmore Schwartz and Gerald Stern, are dealing with in their poetry as Jewish authors. These are the stereotypes they are forced to confront as Jewish authors. So I think that's the explanation. Turning back to this poem, why also does Baraka adopt what I think we can see as a sexist and a homophobic position as part of his nationalism? Well, because I think if you construe the nation, whatever you think that is, a kind of black nation within the nation of the United States, in Baraka's case, as the most important value, then you think that women exist to literally reproduce the nation, to reproduce the people. So the role of women is subordinate. The role of women is to be mothers, is to be wives, and is to reproduce the nation. And similarly, then you would be hostile to gay people, because in this nationalist worldview, again, I'm not trying to justify why Baraka believes why he believes these things. I'm trying to explain what these beliefs are, because I don't think we can challenge them unless we understand what these beliefs are. So his anti-Semitism, his sexism, and then his homophobia comes from his, I would assume, belief that that queer people are not reproducing the nation, because they're not reproducing. They're exiled from that sense of an organic reproductive community. So after all that, why should we read this poem? Why is this still a famous poem? Why is this poem included in a prestigious anthology published by Penguin Books? Why have I put it on the syllabus? And I don't think we would just, I actually think it's valuable to read examples of this kind of rhetoric to see, again, where it comes from, why it is that way. So I think this poem is illustrative of why a nationalist perspective, even one that considers itself emancipatory on behalf of oppressed people, can go wrong. But I also want to look at what in the poem is challenges its own worldview. Because, on the one hand, there's a lot of kind of traditionalist prejudice in this poem. Anti Semitism, sexism, homophobia. These are very old prejudices. On the other hand, there's a lot in this poem that's revolutionary, that is not only revolutionary politically, but revolutionary at the level of poetic form. This is written in free verse. It abandons a lot of traditional typography, traditional grammar in ways that I think are interesting. And it has an ambitious mission for poetry. So yes, we could look at the passages in the poem that I don't particularly want to read aloud, that are hateful. Even the end of the poem that is kind of rousing is problematic, because he says, let me read the last stanza. We want a black poem and a black world. Oh, no, wait, I want to go up. I want to read before that. Let black people understand that they are the lovers and the sons of lovers and warriors and sons of warriors, our poems and poets and all the loveliness here in the world. We want a black poem and a black world. So even that which is rousing, you'll notice the lovers and the sons of lovers and the warriors and the sons of warriors. There's no mention of daughters. So even the rousing conclusion has some of these problematic ideological elements. And yet there's still elements of this poem that I think are interesting. So let's just read. I'm going to read, I'll read it down to the F word at the beginning. So poems are bullshit unless they are teeth or trees or lemons piled on a step or black ladies dying of men leaving nickel hearts beating them down. So that's interesting, because what he's saying there is poems aren't worth anything unless they're as vital and real as the things and experiences that happen in real life. So you see there his roots in both the New York school and the Beat school, both of which I think called for a poetry of everyday life, a poetry of the poet's life, a poetry that would not be about some rarefied experience expressed in some rarefied terms, but a poetry of and about life and the vitality of life. He also says in the most famous, I think, lines from this poem, we want poems that kill, assassin poems, poems that shoot guns, poems that wrestle cops into alleys and take their weapons, leaving them dead with tongues pulled out and sent to Ireland. So right, there's an ethnic stereotype of police, especially in northern cities, being of Irish descent. So, but ignoring that other instance of prejudice in this poem, we nevertheless have a call for a poem that has direct political force, a poem that intervenes directly in the political. And then he says, airplane poems. So I assume the is the whirring of an airplane engine, and the is, if you imagine like an airplane with a machine gun, that's the gun firing. Poems that set fire and death to Whitey's ass. So what interests me here is the poem stops being language as meaning and starts being language as experience. The poem becomes the airplane. The poem becomes gunfire. The poem takes on direct force. Now, I don't, do I like this idea wedded to a bunch of bigoted statements? No. But I do like it isolated from a bunch of bigoted statements. I think it's interesting. And there's something poetically radical about calling for a poem that's that alive, that's that vital. And then finally, I want to read one more line, which is at the top of the third column. Stumbles across the room. Put it on him, poem. I don't know who's groaning there, but I think if you think of this poem as a groan, as the utterance of a suffering individual, then I think you can situate the terrible things about it and try to explain why they came from that individual and what leads an individual to them. And insofar as the poem invites us to see it as not just a manifesto, as not just a set of propositions and statements, but as a groan, as a cry, as an experience, then we don't have to believe him in what he claims. We just have to believe him in what he feels. And I don't know if that's sufficient to in some way compensate for or mitigate the sexism, the anti-Semitism, and the homophobia of the work, but I think we need to confront it head on, because it's still here. It's in this book. It's in the Penguin Anthology of 20th Century American Poetry. It's probably one of the most famous American poems of the 20th century, and Baraka was a major figure. So we have to confront it head on, see what it is, see why it's that way, see why we don't like the things about it we can't accept, see if there's anything in it that we can accept, that we can value. That's the approach I'm taking. You might not agree. You might think it just needs to be dismissed outright. But I think that is a sufficient prologue to talking about our next novel, which is Philip Roth's The Ghostwriter. Philip Roth is also a very controversial writer for different reasons that I'll explain when we get into him. He was also from Newark. He was of the same generation as Amiri Baraka. Both were born in Newark. They're probably the most famous writers of Newark, New Jersey. And if I took a long time explaining Baraka's anti-Semitism, it's because I wanted to lay the groundwork for talking about the challenge Roth, as a Jewish American writer, presents to anti-Semitism in his work, and why some of his fellow Jewish American citizens didn't think it was adequate. He was controversial within his own community, and we have to see why that is. And he was controversial for some of the same reasons Baraka was controversial, having to do with the representations of male sexuality and of women in his work. So we're going to get into all that in the next lecture. We need to talk about all of that and talk about what Roth's Ghostwriter is all about. So the next two lectures will be devoted in their entirety to Philip Roth and to the Ghostwriter. And this concludes our section on the poetry of the postmodernist era. Thanks very much and have a great day.